I think one of the more insidious parts of this, you talk about in the book about Tyson sort of controlling the whole vertical process of, from farm to slaughterhouse, if you will. But they do a similar thing with their workers. And as their workers get sick, and I mean, this was the part that was just shocking to me. It's like they had to go to Tyson nurses who were not prone to give them honest medical assessments. And then when things did escalate, they had to go to Tyson doctors. And I mean, even with this chemical explosion, the only reason they start to learn how damaged their lungs are, one of the guys who dies, is because he actually does go to a doctor who's outside of the Tyson network. Like, Tyson's tentacles in this seem unprecedented to me, but it was just this, like, we're going to control every element of this person, including their medical records, and use it. And this is, I guess, to come back to this, to kind of skirt some of the OSHA rules. I mean, there are guidelines on reporting injuries on site. So how did Tyson get around them? You can dive into that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great question because the way that they do that with a lot of difficult issues is they have third-party providers. And so when I was interviewing workers, and I didn't know anything about the on-site medical clinics, workers would tell me, "Oh, that Tyson nurse," and I was thinking, "What? Who is a Tyson nurse?" And so I started looking into it, and I had also, once again, it wasn't something I was planning on writing about. But I started getting into it, and of course Tyson says, we don't have nurses, we don't have doctors, we have a third-party provider. But what happens is that workers, if they want to go outside of the on-site system, they have to pay for it themselves, which for many is just something that they can't do. And so I had a real breakthrough when I got a Tyson nurse who had worked at several Tyson plants. She was an on-site nurse, what workers would call a Tyson nurse, to speak to me. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done to get her to get anybody. I contacted many people and no one wanted to speak to me. But she said, "Look, we do our best, but we are here. When we're treating workers, we have managers and supervisors from Tyson who are not medically trained, who are weighing in on what we should be doing. And they receive bonuses if we keep injuries down."
Yeah, it's a real cooking of the books in a way that ultimately does lead in some cases to death. So I want to come back to that Placido who loses one of his lungs in that chemical explosion. The other one's damaged, and then he gets COVID and dies. And his wife, Angelina, becomes a really central character in your book because she kind of picks up that torch. She leaves Tyson, and she's one of those people who does speak more candidly to you. She gets involved with Venceremos, and she starts to look into what organizing looks like. So let's talk about that organizing piece of it. What I found really interesting was that they do this field trip to Florida to learn sort of best practices, labor union practices there. Was that a turning point, do you feel, for them? Because ultimately we get to a lawsuit, which we'll come back to in a second. What role and how impactful is Venceremos in a place like this where people are afraid to talk, afraid to be named, sort of operate in the shadows? How do you take on the man in a situation like this?
Venceremos has really changed the landscape of Arkansas. I mean, since I started working on this 4 years ago, for the first time in my life, I saw two workers speak publicly about their experience at Tyson. I mean, I think that's never happened in this state ever.
Yeah.
And that was at a Venceremos event that when I presented my book, two of the workers shared their stories. And so what they're doing is really important, but it's also been extremely difficult. And so Venceremos did organize a trip to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, which is a very successful, it's organization run by agricultural workers in Florida that has really created a model in which workers educate other workers and put pressure on companies and consumers to make better decisions, or decisions that will improve labor conditions.
Yeah.
And so Arkansas workers, many of them some of them had never been on a plane, some of them, many things, many firsts, but none of them had ever seen organizers, workers marching publicly, speaking, in the coalition has their own Spanish radio station. They produce, their own news stories and share story. I mean, just things that in Arkansas would be absolutely unheard of and impossible. And so workers, it just felt like a real turning point in that sense, that they could see that this kind of organizing was possible and could create change.